You're listening to Wildlife Control Consultant, where we provide research-based information on all things related to vertebrate pest management. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing you another episode of the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope your week went well. I am still in the midst of trying to dig out of a lot of obligations and trying to take some time off as well. I'm under contract to fulfill a protocol for a company, and so that has been sucking some of the oxygen out of my sails there a little bit as I'm trying to get that project finished up. But nevertheless, I'm grateful for the work, and I hope your work is going steady as well. You're probably, if you're listening to this, you're probably in the thick of things here for the summer. Hopefully you're going to be able to get a little time off in the summer heat of July, take a few days off maybe around July 4th, and be sure you spend some time with your family. Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast deals with all things related to vertebrate pest management. So we deal with things on a technical level. So we do talk about control methods, but we're going to ask questions and delve into issues that aren't typically going to be gleaned from ordinary experience. So we tend to be a more research-based proposal. So we'll review articles and other topics that are kind of obscure. They won't necessarily put money in your pocket straight away, but chances are I'll be answering questions that you're going to encounter if you stay in this industry for any length of time, because only with information and experience are you going to have a competitive edge over your competition. All right, enough about that. You can see my website here. We have a variety of publications available. Do hope you would take advantage of those. Of course, the one I'm very proud of is the Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook. If you're looking for something that's designed for how to identify damage that wildlife control operators are going to confront from, again, a very technical forensic approach, it's going to be important, because most of the books out there that deal with wildlife identification are really for wilderness situations. My publication deals with damage that humans encounter in structures and lawns and things like that, where human-impacted environments, not out when you're just walking along a stream and wondering what animal made that track. So hope you can check that out, and we have some other equipment and tools there for you as well. Do check it out and see if something there makes sense for you. Also provide some consultation services, of course, and as well as if you need help with your PowerPoint development, something researched out, perhaps doing some training for your company, definitely reach out to me. How do you get hold of me? Well, it's quite simple. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right. What am I going to talk about this week? Well, let me bring my PowerPoint up here. We're going to talk a little bit about voles. Now, if you're not familiar with voles are sometimes called meadow mice. These are organisms that are mouse-like, but they tend not to invade structures. They like to be out in the grassy fields, and some also are more forested animals like the woodland vole. You may know of it as the pine vole. So there was an interesting article that I read, and I want to talk about some of the elements of that. But in the meantime, let's talk a little about identification of voles, because sometimes there's a lot of confusion about how to identify them. So let's talk about some common animals that they are confused with. The first one, of course, is shrews. Now, shrews and voles are two very different animals. So a vole is a vegetarian and is a rodent. A shrew is not. So notice the jaw, notice the skull structure of the shrew comes to a nice little point. Voles have a blunt nose, shrews are going to have a pointy nose. Shrews are dieting on meat, and sometimes if you're setting mouse traps and you're wondering what's been gnawing on my mice, well, sometimes that's a shrew that came along and took a little nibble on your trapped mouse. Notice how the vole is a rodent and with the two incisors, of course, the paired incisors, top and bottom, and of course you can see the carnivorous type teeth that are characteristic of the shrew. Shrews tend to be insectivores, right? So they're going after insects. They'll also eat worms, and of course they'll take other flesh as well. So that's a key distinction. Now, how do we separate voles from mice? And so probably the easiest way to do that is to look at the ears. I call it Mickey Mouse ears, right? So Mickey Mouse, big ears. Voles have more hidden ears. The ears are still there, but you tend to only see the top half, top third of the vole ears, where mouse ears, like Mickey Mouse, quite pronounced. You can also take a look at the eyes. The eyes tend to be much smaller for voles as opposed to mice. And then, of course, the tail. So vole tails tend to be less than half the length of the body. Mouse tails tend to be more than half the length of the body. And so those are some very quick and easy ways of identifying whether you're dealing with a vole, whether you're dealing with a mouse in a field setting. All right? So hope that helps you in terms of those identifications. Now, the question we wanted to ask this week is, how much does a vole eat? So you're probably familiar, if you've been around for any length of time, you've probably been familiar with some of the damage that voles can cause. They can really tear up some people's yards. They can damage trees, particularly young trees, by debarking. If you are a fruit tree grower, they could be devastating to your fruit crops. But even if you're not a fruit tree grower, perhaps you have an alfalfa field, voles can have a significant impact, but not every year, right? So how much does a vole actually eat? Well, that's a rather difficult question to answer. So we're not going to answer it perfectly today, but we are going to give you some insight in terms of how much a vole actually eats. So one publication I looked at said a vole eats approximately their body weight a day. So a meadow vole, which is one of the larger voles in the United States, can weigh 2 ounces. It can weigh more than that, but let's just sort of, to use some round numbers, it weighs 2 ounces. Now, if this article was correct, that means a vole would eat 2 ounces of vegetation every day. So you multiply that by 365 days a year. We're going to ignore leap year, okay? So, and then we're going to divide that number by 16 to give us pounds, and it gives us 45.63 pounds per year. That's a lot. Okay, that's a lot of diet for such a small animal, right? So this is something that can have a significant impact. Now, but is it true? That's a lot. You hear these reports from time to time that animals eat their body weight a day, but is it actually true? The only way you really can identify that is true or not is you have to have laboratory studies. Now, laboratory studies are not perfect because they don't mirror the experience of a vole under real world conditions. Now they can come close. They can put they can make it cold inside the laboratory, right, to try to mimic outside temperature, because voles have to burn up a lot of calories keeping themselves warm. And they can try to mimic daylight, nighttime, that sort of thing, but they really can't include like predator situations, running away, the consumption, the food needed to mate and to raise young, right? So those are some limits to what can be done in the laboratory. So understand that laboratory studies, as valuable as they are and as necessary as they are, they're not perfect. So you kind of have to have a little bit of fudge factor when you convert laboratory data into field data, right? So if generally speaking, you could use the rule of thumb as a rule of thumb, okay, laboratory diet eating is going to be less than what an animal could possibly eat in the field, assuming the animal has equal access to the food, right? So another issue, of course, in nature is that an animal doesn't always have perfect access to food that they would have in a laboratory, okay? But as a general rule, An animal's going to need to eat more in the wild because of the stresses that are involved environmentally and behaviorally than what it would need to eat to maintain body weight in a laboratory. Okay, so according to this article, I'm not going to point it out here, but it said that they eat about their body weight a day. Okay, well, if that's true, then that's 45 pounds, 45 and a half pounds per meadow vole per year. So if you've got 100 meadow voles in your acre field, which is a high number, but it's possible, that's a staggering amount of food. But is it true? Okay, so let's take a look at this piece of information that came from an article by Zynel and Wunder, W-U-N-D-E-R, that was published in 2002, and the title of it was called The Limits to Food Intake by the Prairie Vole. Now, a prairie vole is not a meadow vole, but they're similar, and a prairie vole is going to be slightly smaller than a meadow vole, but we're going to be in that framework, right? Now, according to this particular publication, it said that the voles that it had in its possession were about 53.2 grams in body weight. Now, that translates into about 1.88 ounces. So as I said before, prairie voles are smaller than their meadow vole counterparts. But that's okay because we can adjust by percentages in terms of how much does a prairie vole eat, right? Now, what they found in the laboratory, and they were doing a series of studies, and we'll talk about some of them here, they found that the voles were eating about 7.68 grams of food per day. Now, if they believed that the dietary consumption of these voles in the laboratory was about 50% of what the voles would actually consume in nature. So if you had voles in your lab, calculated how much they ate, and you captured voles that were out in the field and calculated how much they ate, they believed that the voles in the field were eating twice as much as the voles in the laboratory. So you'll notice the number here, that the vole was eating about 0.54 ounces. Now, if you do some quick math, you'll know that that's not even a third of their body weight a day, even under natural conditions. So if we assume the vole was eating in nature, out in your field, for example, or in your grass, that he would only be consuming 12.32 pounds per year. That's a big difference from the meadow vole, which would be 45.63 pounds per year, assuming that they ate their body weight. The research seems to suggest voles probably don't eat their body weight in food a day. But it is reasonable to think that voles are eating possibly over a quarter of their body weight a day. Of course, there's going to be variables there, right? We're trying to average things out. A vole is going to need to probably eat more in the wintertime than it's going to be needing to eat in the summer because of heat, warmth issues, right? But nevertheless, we're using rules of thumb. It is probably a wiser thing to be on the more conservative side. But even still, if you have a vole consuming 12.32 pounds a year, that's a lot of forage, right? For those of you that are producers, that is a lot of consumption of resources that you're going to need in order to try to make money off your land. If you're a homeowner and you've got grass, that is a lot of grass that they're going to be eating. And of course, now you can see why the kind of damage that you can get over the wintertime. They are incredibly food stressed at that time because a lot of plants are not growing, and so they have to eat whatever's available, and the damage can be quite severe. So keep that in mind. Just maybe as a rule of thumb, just tell people a vole is probably going to eat anywhere from a quarter to a third of its body weight a day. Much safer proposition. Now, there's a difference. Got to add one more caveat here, right? Because these things are a little bit more complicated. People just want simple answers, and I like simple answers. I love simple answers, but not everything is quite so simple. the other issue is that even though you say, well, the vole's only eating 12 pounds a year, that's nothing. But you also have to consider how the vole's behavior and activity, he may only eat that much, but he may destroy or damage far more vegetation than that. Let me illustrate. So if you have a blade of grass that, let's say the blade of grass is, let's call it 4 inches tall, okay? And the vole eats the grass at the base, at the root, right? Which is typical vole behavior. They'll chew things at the root level. Sometimes they'll eat the roots, but they'll eat that crown area and maybe go up a little bit higher and eat that. Notice how they're only eating a third of their body weight a day, but how much did they destroy? Because once that plant is cut off from its roots, that entire stem dies. That entire blade of grass dies, even though the vole only ate a small portion of it. So keep in mind that a vole can damage far more resources than what it necessarily eats. Think of it as a messy eater, right? Someone may just take their ice cream scoop and just scoop something up, eat out of it, scoop something up, eat out of it, spill some on the floor, maybe not put it back in the freezer. You say, well, they only ate a pint. Yeah, but they may have destroyed a whole half a gallon by the way that they treated it. Okay, so definitely keep that in mind. All right, so what's this study that was done? Well, we've already seen some of the results of this particular study, right? But how did they perform their work here? This Zynel and Wunder back in 2002, and they published this. Well, this is what they did, is they took some prairie voles, and they had them in a laboratory, and they treated them, they had them feed in 3 different ways. So they divided them up into 3 different groups. The control voles were able to eat any time of day. Okay, they could eat what's called ad libitum, which means at will, right? The second group of voles were what's called the block fed. They were only allowed to eat for a period of 3 hours each 24-hour period. And then the third group of voles were only allowed to eat in what's called intervals. That is for 30-minute segments at a time, in which there were 6 segments throughout the 24-hour period. So every 4 hours, they were allowed to eat for 30 minutes. And what they did is they weighed these voles to see if they were gaining weight, maintaining weight, or losing weight. Fascinating question. So what were the results of their work? They found that the voles that were eating under control conditions, that means they could eat at any time that they wanted, they gained 3 grams. That's a lot, right? The block-fed group that were only allowed to eat for 3 hours each day lost 6 grams, which is a staggering amount of food, amount of weight for an animal that's only weighs 1.88 grams to begin with, right? 1.88 ounces, to begin with. That's a lot. The interval group lost 3 grams, significantly less than the block fed. And so then they said, okay, what is the reason why voles don't eat more, right? Why didn't the block fed voles just pound down as much as they could eat, right? Like you would, if you knew you were in prison and you knew you could only eat 3 hours a day, how much would you eat during that 3-hour period, right? Probably a lot. Well, why didn't the voles do this as well? Why didn't they adapt to those new conditions? Because the interval-fed voles tended to consume a little bit more, and their weight leveled off, and they think that they could have survived on this interval-fed diet, whereas the other voles, they didn't think, they were concerned, right? So when these research goes on, there's organizations known as IACUC, that's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees, that monitor how the animals that are under study are being treated. And they had a rule that said once a vole lost 10% of its body weight, the study for that vole had to stop. Okay, so there are, so we can't always study things down to death, because the IACUC committee, they're trying to be humane to the animals and not cause undue pain. That doesn't have a viable research result from it, right? So they didn't take it any further, but they believe, the researchers believe, that the interval-fed voles could survive it, but they weren't convinced that the block-fed voles would survive if it continued on. What is the reason why the voles couldn't eat more? Well, what their theory was, and they have pretty good evidence for this, and they said it's the size of the vole's stomach. That even though the voles could increase their stomach size somewhat, particularly under cold conditions, and they were getting this research from someone else that was really studying a different species of vole, but nevertheless, those voles could increase their stomach size slightly to try to consume more under cold weather conditions. As I said before, voles need more food in the wintertime because they've got to maintain body heat. Okay, they lose a lot of energy out of their extremities and out of their body because of their small size. But the researchers found that a vole could only eat about 1.4 grams at a time. So when you're in an interval, or excuse me, in the not the interval, but in the block feeding, basically the voles were spending a lot of time they would eat initially, of course, because they were hungry, but then they'd have to sit by waiting for their food to digest in order for them to be able to feed more. And there wasn't enough time for them to continue getting that food in, digesting and getting into the system and go back and feed again within 3 hours in order to maintain their body weight. So what does this mean for us? Voles are eating throughout the day and likely throughout the night. Something for you to think about. They're doing a lot of small little trips as they're doing their work. So voles are going to feed according to their energy needs. They can feed during the day, they can feed during the night, they can feed at dawn, they can feed at dusk. It's going to vary, right? And there are also some beliefs that voles will change their feeding behaviors to try to avoid certain types of predators. So nevertheless, what is the limiting factor for voles in terms of how much they can eat? The size of their stomach. How much can they eat? Well, about 1.4 grams, at least when it comes to what I call P voles here, which is the prairie vole. Okay, so we suspect this is the same thing for other voles as well, that the stomach is a limiting factor, which causes them to feed, hide, feed, hide, feed, hide. Right? So because they've got to have time to digest their food, put it into their intestines, and then go back out and feed some more. Additionally, remember, it's also a factor of the quality of the food. Vole diets aren't always on the most highest nutritious grasses and other plant life, so they have to take advantage of whatever's available. So sometimes they have to eat more bulk in order to compensate for the poor forage that they're consuming in order to get enough nutrients and calories to keep them going. Pretty technical, to be sure. Takeaways are voles have to eat frequently, right? So what that means for us sometimes is make sure that we have enough material in our bait stations to feed them appropriately, because a lot of them are going to be picking away at it, right? And also make sure you have enough of your bait stations out there or your food to make sure the voles can find it, right? They're not running a marathon. They're not going to be traveling a quarter of a mile to get to your bait stations. And then lastly, make sure you remember, how do we identify what a vole is compared to a mouse? And how do we identify a vole compared to a shrew? They're a bunch different animals. Hope you found that helpful today. My name is Stephen Vantassel. I'm the owner of Wildlife Control Consultant, and you've been listening to the Wildlife Control Consultant podcast. Do love to hear from you. You can comment, of course, in the comments below, or you can reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. You have a topic you would like to cover, you'd have an issue you'd like to deal with, definitely reach out to me. We'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have you on the show. Just as a side note, I'll probably talk a little bit more about this maybe in my next podcast. But sometimes people want to have sort of a pre-interview before we have the interview. I don't really do that per se. I don't have enough time to do that sort of thing. So I think that often occurs because for some reason, some business owners typically, that's where I've really kind of gotten it from as business owners. They seem to be scared of the interview process if somehow I do gotcha journalism. I don't do gotcha journalism. I do ask some tough questions, but I also give people the opportunity to skip the questions. But I am going to ask questions related to what wildlife control operators are going to need. For example, if you have a particular product that manages or controls or provides a particular control method for XYZ animal, I'm going to explore both the efficacy of the particular product and its efficiency, right? So how well does it work, and how cost effective is it? And what are the pros of it? What are the cons of it, right? And you as an owner should be able to handle that. If you can't, then I would really question really the validity of your product, right? I had an article that I was writing, this is probably almost 20 years ago, and I was reaching out to one of the distributors of the particular product, and it was a fine product, and I basically asked them the question, when should you not use it? When should you not use this trap? And the distributor says, oh, I don't know if I can answer that question. I'm like, well, why is that a complicated question? And he said, I think the manufacturer will be upset with me if I answer it. That's the kind of thing that just seems to me to breed some distrust, right? So if you're selling a product, not every product can be the Shangri-La for every situation. For example, I love footholds. Footholds are a very powerful tool, but I don't recommend them for every situation. Now, I'm not a manufacturer of footholds, but footholds are probably the most versatile trap in the world, right? But nevertheless, if you're in downtown Manhattan, even if it was legal, I would not suggest using a foothold to catch an animal within Manhattan. There are situations where I probably could suggest it, right? But you kind of get the idea. In other words, if you're producing something, you need to be talking about the pros and the cons, because we're dealing with some technical information, and I have to maintain, of course, some intellectual integrity for the audience. But nevertheless, I try not to be hostile. If you look at some of my interviews in the past, I have been very I think fair, very forthright, very positive. I did have one person that I invited onto the show that he did not arrive. He didn't come on the show, but I did tell him, I'd warned him in advance I would be asking some tough questions, and that was for a frightening device that he was selling. I don't think the evidence for frightening devices work all that well, but nevertheless, I'm always open for data, right? We want to have evidence that supports them, and unfortunately, he did not want to come to that. I would have been very polite, but I would have pressed him on some of the claims that he made, but unfortunately, we never did have him. That's concerning because we really need good resources within the wildlife control community, and if a frightening device works, I'm all in. Right, so I'm happy to have my skepticism shot away. Right, it's not a problem. So hope that helps those of you that are thinking about joining the show. Would love to hear from you. Definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right, that's it for now, everyone. Take care.
This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant Podcast. Vertebrate pest control is an inherently dangerous activity involving risk of bodily injury to you, others, and/or property. Vertebrate pest control also involves legal issues, so be sure to always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods when controlling pests. Wildlife Control Consultant LLC, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their affiliates are not responsible for your use of the information provided here. Always consult a qualified and appropriate professional before employing the information provided here.